The year is 1981, and before we lost Charles Bronson to the depths of Canon Pictures, we got one more top-tier action film out of him, that being Peter H. Hunt's Death Hunt. This loose adaptation of a true story follows Charles Bronson as the infamous Albert Johnson, the mad trapper of Rat River. After pissing off some locals by saving a dying fighting dog, it's up to the head of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Edgar Millen, and his team of ragtag Mounties to smoke out Albert and take him in. However, those plans are thwarted by the interference of a vengeful militia. Thus begins the thrilling manhunt across the Canadian wilderness. This week on the Cultworthy, I am joined by Eric Clapp of Cinema Force as we take on Death Hunt.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Eric, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Cinema Force, it's such a great channel. It's such a great thing you got going. So before we get into the Charles Bronsonness, before we get into the Death Hunt, let's introduce you to my listeners. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about Cinema Force.
Cool. Yeah. So Cinema Force started, I was kind of looking for something to kind of get my cinema stuff out there, just my love of cinema. And I have a production company here in Fort Worth that I've had in Fort Worth, Texas for about, 10, 11 years now. And we do a lot of production work, but I never could, it's all kind of corporate and commercial documentary mostly. And so I wanted to kind of apply that to my love for cinema. So I started Cinema Force. And one of the things that, I really wanted to do was a Charles Bronson documentary initially. And that sort of morphed into Cinema Force. So I'm still working on that. So that's kind of how it got started.
Well, I love that you picked the Charles Bronson subject in the list of episodes. I'm glad that you came prepared and you are dressed for the occasion.
That's right.
Because we are talking about Death Hunt. Before I get into your story about your love for Charles Bronson, I got to kind of just fill people in who haven't already heard me talk about it before on my show. When I think of Charles Bronson, I think of my dad. They are very similar in appearance. I think Bronson was a little bit taller, but my dad was like an amateur boxer. He was an aerial acrobat in the circus. So he had a Charles Bronson build and he had a Charles Bronson pug-like face. So I always associate the two. And Charles Bronson was his favorite actor. So I grew up weaned literally on Charles Bronson movies. If it was on VHS, if it was on TV, if it was on all the encores back in the 90s, they had Western, action, comedy, whatever. They loved Charles Bronson on Encore back in the day. So there was always Charles Bronson going on in my house. But my dad had three favorites of the Charles Bronson movies. It was Once Upon a Time in the West, which is my personal favorite. It was this film, Death Hunt, and then it was Hard Times, the Walter Hill film. Those three films, to me, fully encompass the three Charles Bronson aesthetics, because you had the good guy, you had the guy on the run, and then you had the mysterious stranger. Death Wish, in my opinion, is its own thing. The vigilanteism, it's synonymous with Bronson in those movies, but it was also its entirely own genre. And as they got further down the sequels, I feel like they're fun, but they kind of lost the relevance and the importance of what the first film was trying to represent. So that's my take on Bronson. How about you? What is your love for Bronson? Where does it stem from?
Well, my parents definitely weren't as incredible as yours. They didn't come from that background. But very similarly, my love of Bronson came from my mom. My dad was somewhat of a cinephile, but my mom was more of a TV person. But she always loved Charles Bronson. And whenever Bronson was on, we'd watch whatever was on. And so she actually really loved Death Wish. She loved the vigilante stuff. She loved when people got revenge. And yeah. I think she kind of was my initiation into Bronson. I was like, what's the big deal with this guy? And it was always his quietness, his man of few words type of thing, man of action. I think that's what my mom kind of liked. And so I have to say that my mom was responsible for my love of Charles Bronson.
I think my mom just had like a massive crush on him too. I'm almost willing to bet that that's one of the reasons why she married my dad in the early 70s because, it's an interesting thing too because no one really calls Charles Bronson handsome, but there is like a sex appeal to the dude. For one, he was cut out of wood. Like the guy just had a physique even until like his older days. Like, man, like that guy working in the mines as a kid, I guess all those years really puts that Adonis figure on you. But also like the smirk and the scowl, and when a smile would peek through every now and then, like you'd get this idea of like who this guy might really be. And I just think that he's a very unique movie star. He's a very unique actor because he doesn't fit the conventional mold of what a movie star should be. I would say that Clint Eastwood might kind of fit in that same aesthetic, except, he's taller, a little bit more scraggly, kind of like an Abe Lincoln physique, but the same. Like there's a mysteriousness and like almost like a quiet seductiveness to the guy that makes him appealing, especially for action films and dramas. And even comedies too. I like the monkey movies. What can I say? But yeah, like we don't get to see stars like this as much anymore because just like they made fun of in Fight Club in 1999, like there is a certain aesthetic you have to meet in order to be that kind of leading guy, or you're a character actor. You're a Steve Buscemi, you're a Philip Seymour Hoffman. And I think maybe we're starting to see a little bit of backpedaling from that now that we have streaming in the mix and more unconventional actors. I think David Harbour's a great example, being on Stranger Things and then being able to lead movies and have like a sex appeal for a guy who's essentially kind of like a dad bod guy. I think we're ready to go back to that and get out of that male model aesthetic of the 90s and early 2000s. But man, like these guys, this generation, the Charles Bronson, the Lee Marvin, the Clint Eastwood, they definitely use the machismo to their advantage to kind of put themselves ahead of the Redfords and the Newmans and so on and so forth,
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, Bronson stands alone. Like he's unique. Like you said, you don't see anybody that looks like him today.
Right.
I was just watching the sequel to Twister yesterday, Twisters, and there's like no way like Charles Bronson would be something like a Glenn Powell or something
No.
like that. Like when you're watching Twisters, you're just like, man, I'm a heterosexual guy, but he's really attractive. And I don't know if with Bronson you don't really get that. He's like the guy you see on the corner or something that's like, yeah, I'm going to go the other way. I'm not
Right,
crossing
right.
the street that way. But Glenn Powell looks like he might help me out or something. But
It's funny too because like I think Bill Paxton was the perfect guy for that first Twister movie. He's not unattractive. He's got like a rugged masculinity to him, but he also seems gentle enough to like want to hug him, And you don't see a lot of actors like that anymore leading action films. It has to be a Glenn Powell. It has to be a Tom Cruise. Although I was impressed when they had Bob Odenkirk do the John Wick stuff with his Nobody movie. I was kind of impressed by that. That's what I'm talking about.
yeah,
Being unconventional is kind of cool again.
yeah, I did. I like that movie a lot too for that specific reason. Like it was
Exactly.
it was not. It was like a regular guy.
Right, right. And I think that's what we want a little bit more of. Well, when I say we, I mean like the cinematic people like you and me. My mom still wants to look at a handsome dude on the big screen. What can I say? But
Well, yeah, I get that too. But there is something to be said about Bronson's like uniqueness and physique and grizzly look. Like, he looks like he could go either way at any second. You're not really sure. And I think that's what really sets him apart from everybody. I mean, to me, there's no one right now that you could compare Charles Bronson to.
no, absolutely not. Well, I think there is. I can't remember if he is like, if he's Greek or if he's European, but they do have a Charles Bronson like emulation somewhere in Europe who does like Charles Bronson mock movies. I have to look that one up.
Yeah,
But
I know what
yeah,
you're talking about. Yeah, I've seen that guy. I forgot what his name is too, but yeah, he
and it's a
has the
play on
look.
Charles Bronson.
Yeah,
He's got the look.
he's got the look, but he doesn't have the voice.
As we get into this conversation about Death Hunt, which I kind of mentioned in the synopsis, I feel like this is the transitional period of as we're getting him, because he was kind of already off the A-list, but he was still making some higher profile movies. movies for either De Laurentiis groups and stuff like that before he kind of fell into the cannon fodder. And I'm not trying to say that in a derogatory fashion. I like the cannon fodder. I like the movies he did for Cannon, but you can't deny that they were made with a certain bit of grindhouse charm, some camp charm. They were definitely for that B movie audience, despite how much Golan Globus thought how prestige their movies were. At the end of the day, these were just kind of throwaway cinemas, but they were fun. So when you look at his timeline, when you look at his resume, it really goes from this into Death Wish 2, which some people say is like the beginning of that descent into those vigilante, grisly, murdery, violent, gory, and some say, distasteful cinema. It's all subjective, in my opinion. But I think this was a great way to transition because there is still some prestige to this movie. There are prestige actors, there's prestige action, and it wasn't just a throwaway movie. There's a lot of value production wise in this. Great characters, great action, and I like the fact that it's kind of old man action. We're watching two older guys chase each other through the Canadian wilderness, through tundras, through snow caps, through glaciers. And it's just a lot of fun. And I really wish I could have seen this on the big screen. I wasn't old enough. I can put it on my projector at home, but it doesn't do it justice of what it would have looked like in the theater at the time.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I first saw this on VHS. Obviously, I was probably a little too young. Well, I mean, I don't know if I was too young, but I was probably a little too young to see it. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, that Death Hunt to me is a movie about two, like the old ways going away and the new things
Mm-hmm.
coming in, and it really is kind of a, I don't know. It's kind of emblematic of both Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson's career at that time. They are running, they're running out of time, and it's kind of cool that they're both chasing each other too. I like that aesthetic and the fact that they don't understand the present.
Like they don't give you a lot of Albert Johnson's backstory. It's based loosely on a true story. Essentially, it is just following the idea that there was a mad trapper out in the Canadian wilderness that was collecting teeth from other trappers, a proto serial killer, you might say. And everyone assumed that it was this guy, Albert Johnson. And no one really knows if that was his real name. In the movie, we're kind of given like a man with no name kind of character archetype to him, where he shows up out of nowhere. And yes, you can tell that he's got a dark past, a dark history. He's probably a killer of some sort or has killed. Yet there's that compassion for a dog that is being essentially torn apart in a dog fight. And we got Ed Lauter in there, and you got to have Ed Lauter in a Charles Bronson movie in the 70s. What are you going to do?
Well, he popped up later in Death Wish 3 too.
Death Wish 3, absolutely, right? So that kind of builds like what kind of character we're going to expect with him. It's like there is a compassion to him, but the compassion for humans essentially is over and done with. He's lived his human life. He's really just looking for a place to grow old and die. And this dog is going to be his companion once he patches him up. He pays the dude not enough, according to him, which causes this struggle. Now, when I went back and read the history about Albert Johnson, for one, he was a lot younger than the movie portrays, as was the Lee Marvin character. Apparently, the Edgar Millen in real life was in his late 20s, early 30s, essentially the Andrew Stevens character of this film. But I don't mind that. I don't mind the artistic liberties a movie takes to kind of build a good character dynamic and chemistry. And that's why, like exactly what you said, Lee Marvin coming in and being the kind of end of his rope Canadian Mounties, been up there way too long. He's beyond giving a shit. And these two guys are really just kind of at the end of their paths until they're pulled into a conflict that neither of them wants. And that's just great storytelling, right? Like it doesn't have to be an epic film. If you can pull your audience in and get them to believe what the conflict is and what the consequence of that conflict is going to be very simply, and have charismatic actors to do it, well, that's a brand of storytelling I think we've lost in the last 20 years.
Yeah, it's a nice touch too. And I listened to the Blu-ray that I had, and it has commentary by the screenwriters on there. and
Mhm.
they talked that they actually wrote the script, based on the Mad Trapper concept, or theory of it, or whatever happened. But they actually did write it specifically for Charles Bronson, which I thought was pretty interesting.
And I think that modern audiences who haven't seen this movie, if they go back and rediscover it, I think they'll see that there is a lot of DNA in the crossover between this film and the character dynamic and interactions of Tommy Lee Jones and Harrison Ford in The Fugitive. Like there is, I'm not going to say a sympathy, but there's an empathy, but also an understanding that not all of the pieces are at play here, that they don't have all the information, but they still have a job to do. They have to capture this guy. I would say that The Fugitive and this film actually make a great double feature because they're different enough, yet they have the same DNA where there is a lot of kind of crossover thematically. And I think that chemistry works great between the Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson as older. Because in Dirty Dozen, they have a great chemistry there, but it's not as grizzled, right? I mean, you have one man who's in command, and then you have the other one who's a criminal, but they do have a nice kind of, I'm going to say, comedic and comedically friendly rapport between each other, where in this film, they don't get that. They get very little screen time at all. But the respect and the almost playful jabbing at each other through smiles and winks and nods across the tundra, well, that speaks volumes in terms of character chemistry that we don't have to see them sharing dialogue in the same screen with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's not exposition city. They
Right.
don't need that. Those two guys, like Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson, can say a lot with just a stare, like the way their face, the lines in their face, their eyes. And for goodness sakes, man, we got to get Lee Marvin an eyebrow trimmer for Christmas. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Um, yeah, I was also reading that, what I was going to say is that I think that the movie reminded me yesterday when I watched it of like a grumpy old men version of First Blood too. Like, you know,
There's a lot of First Blood. Hmm.
yeah, there's a lot of scenes that are similar. Like the jumping in the tree. That's the first
Yes.
thing I was like, oh my gosh, we're watching First Blood here.
Yeah, no, I recognize a lot of that too, and the ability to be adept in the wilderness and living off the land and not having any resources. I'd say that the difference is the fact that Brian Dennehy's character has zero respect or admiration for John Rambo, yet Millen, you see the respect and you see the willingness to shut it down. Like he knows that Ed Lauter and his militia. And let's talk about them really fast. What a great group of character actors that would shine later on. You have William Sanderson, you got Maury Chaykin, all showing up as these different kind of quirky characters, and I liked that. It shows like this ragtag bunch of mountain men. Essentially, they're being in the genre that they would kind of play the rest of their lives, like second banana, weird character. But the cross comparison between Rambo, I agree with, where like yes, there is a militia after a guy. The lack of respect in Rambo that we don't see here between Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson, that great moment that they do share when he knocks on the cabin door and he's like, hey man, these guys are looking for any reason to kill you. Let me bring you in. You'll be back home in 3 days. We just got to straighten this out. I got to keep up appearances that I am in charge of this town, right? Because I'm the chief of the Mounties. And you almost think that Bronson trusts him enough to go through with it. He's like, I'm not your conventional kind of, I'm going to do whatever you say, officer, and go with you. But I think he's smart enough to understand what he is facing. But let's not forget, he's also prepared for it. Like this guy's always prepared. He's prepared with his weaponry. He's prepared with the way his cabin is set up. It's almost like he has a tactical advantage at all times. So when the militia does try and pull a sneak shot on him and a sneak attack, Marvin doesn't even flip out. He's like, well, shit, I guess we're at a war now. Let's dig this guy out. I don't want to do it, but it's my job.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love Marvin's performance because he can say so much by doing so little. And there's very few actors, I think, that can pull that off.
Yeah, and I think Lee Marvin too. Like I think Lee Marvin's performance was my favorite from the movie because he's a fascinating figure. But I think as I've gotten older, I identify more with what Lee Marvin is talking about. Like if you've been doing something for so long and you see the light at the end of the tunnel, you're kind of like, I just want to get through this day and the next day. I don't want any trouble. Just
Right.
let's just keep it going. And I think Bronson, through osmosis of age, as that character, kind of understood that. He's like, okay, I understand this guy that's talking to me. He's not like Ed Lauter out there. I understand what this guy's talking about. He's reasonable. He's sensible. I can talk to this guy. But then when the posse goes crazy, it's just, everything, goes off the map. But the through line through that film is that little conversation at the cabin between those two guys. Like, I think they both respect each other, even though they're at odds.
And one of the things that I recognize in this last watch too is, what attracts people to these small towns like this. You know, we see it in movies about the gold rush. Like, what attracts people out to pan for gold? You've got these rich industrialists that are going out there for adventure and trying to make more money. Then you got people who just don't fit in with society, and so maybe going out into the wilderness and trying to seek their fortune by digging and by panning is the way to go. This movie doesn't paint it out for you clearly, but you do get the idea where we are dealing with different types of personalities here. Where, for example, Carl Weathers' character, who's one of the Mounties, he can't make it in the real world because of the color of his skin, because of not being able to pursue his dream as a professional baseball player. So he ends up in the Canadian tundra as a Mountie. Yet Andrew Stevens is the ambitious young guy who really could be doing anything anywhere else, but he's so ambitious, he wants to kind of go to somewhere where he can rise the ladder quicker and be in charge faster. So a small town with aging Mounties is the perfect place. He's going to bring technology with him. He's going to bring the radio. He's going to bring a list of laws that these guys probably haven't even heard of, right? So that's his reason for going out there. Then you see the people like Ed Lauter and his gang who are really just, psychopaths and sociopaths that didn't fit in normal society. So they are kind of wrenching a living out of the tundra. And that's why they're dogfighting. That's why they're causing trouble when trouble doesn't need to be caused. So it's smart from the writers. It's smart from the filmmakers of kind of explaining why people like this end up in areas of the world like that for different reasons, but all those reasons make sense.
Yeah, and that's what great. That's what makes Death Hunt so cool too. Are the supporting characters, because all those people that are part of the posse or around the town are all people that didn't fit in somewhere else, and they're all
Right.
here, for a reason. Like you mentioned, I keep wanting to say Apollo Creed. Uh, you keep mentioning Carl Weathers' character, not being able to play in the big league baseball team because of the color of his skin, and even there's even a not to jump too far ahead, but there's a very interesting scene with Ed Lauter and Andrew Stevens,
Mhm.
where Ed Lauter plants one on him, like kisses him, and you're trying to think, oh, is this another person that was rejected from society and now he's here, with Carl Weathers and Lee Marvin. And I just thought that was a really interesting dynamic. They don't really go back to it once they do it, but they do let that scene play out for a while, which I thought was interesting. So I just love how all the supporting characters, they seem to have their own little arcs and stories, and they're all very interesting. And that's something we don't get today at all.
No, I agree. And the fact that we even have like the real, spoiler alert, mad trapper out there who's been just living his life off the land. I'm not sure if you've seen the film Jeremiah Johnson with Robert Redford.
Yeah.
He kind of reminds me of like the grizzly hunter who's just been living out there, taking out grizzlies and stuff like that by himself for decades. So when that twist does come, it's not entirely unexpected, but it's also not entirely surprising that that's the kind of guy that would be doing that. And then there's also that playful thing later where Bronson is like, my father told me never to trust you. So it shows that not only did Bronson have a history with this guy, his dad did. That there is like this generational, I'm going to say, trauma between these mountain men that goes on generation after generation of like, these guys were there before society caught up with this territory that they're in, right? They were out there trapping and living off the land before a town popped up, before Mounties arrived. And I can really respect that storytelling of like when you said the old ways versus the new ways, and we've seen films do that. I mean, even Killers of the Flower Moon pretty much kind of had that mentality to it that we can all understand. It's not necessarily gentrification that we recognize today, but we do see people who feel out of touch in the world now because everything's moving so quickly with technology, with the internet, with social media, whatever. It's just our version of what these guys are dealing with, of centuries old practice being eliminated so quickly with the advent of technology and society that, it might cause someone to go kill people and pull their teeth out. It's like, well, I don't know how to make real money, so I'm going to go pull gold teeth so I can live in this crazy world.
Yeah, he's almost like the mad trapper guy who gets the gold out of people's teeth. He almost represents like the coming of a serial killer type of scenario, or someone who doesn't want to work hard to get gold by panning for it. He would just rather kill people than get it out of their teeth. It'd be a lot easier for him, maybe, or maybe he's psychotic or something like that.
And because he doesn't show up in regular society, no one's going to suspect him, right? Oh, he's just the guy that goes out there and lives off the land, One of the things this movie does do, I'm going to say, with its setting and its cinematography, is I live in a nice warm climate. Watching this movie made me cold. Watching them in these fur snowsuits and these fur boots and the snowshoes. And there's scenes too, like, I'm not sure if you recognize, but I believe it was Ed Lauter's character. There's a scene where he's like reaching for a pot and his fingers are black, as if he has just chronic frostbite and he just lives with it. Like, little moments like that really made me understand and feel physically like, oh, this is such a chilling environment. And people live here. People live like this. Like, they've almost forgotten what the comforts of warmth are. And this is the environment they chose to live in. Sometimes, cinematically, people fail at making you feel so disconnected from the environment, where, like, this is obviously a set. This is obviously fake snow. So we've got all these snow-covered streets, but no one has steam coming out of their mouths, right? And no one's shivering. This movie looks freezing cold. The actors are cold. I'm sure the crew was freezing their balls off, and you feel it watching the film. It's very visceral the way it made me feel.
Well, it gets colder as it goes along too. Like, there's more snow. There's a little bit of snow in the beginning, and progresses and progresses and progresses, and it gets colder and colder and colder, and more ice, more snow, and to the point where at the end it's just very beautiful. Like, they're like in complete snow-covered everything, and you can see Bronson's face is just red. Like, he's really
so red,
cold, really, really cold.
Marvin's too. Like, there's a moment right at the end when they're inspecting the body of Albert Johnson after he's been shot, and I thought there was something wrong with my color setting on my TV. I'm like, oh my God, Lee Marvin's face is so red. Is that my TV? Do I have to like fix the color settings? No, it's just, that's how cold these guys were, and that's like a real dedication to the craft. It's funny because everyone gave Leo all those applauses for The Revenant, and he got his Oscar. But I'm like, go back and watch these movies. Go back and watch Jeremiah Johnson and Death Hunt. Like, these guys weren't after an Oscar. They were just working. This was just the film set for them.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure Charles Bronson would have fought a real bear if you asked him to.
And you would have won.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's not even a contest. No one would even have a bet on that. No, I did love the cinematography and stuff, and I think a lot of that, Peter Hunt directed this, and he did On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is one of my favorite Bonds, and he knows how to do things in snow. I didn't think this film was as slick as Her Majesty's Secret Service. Like, it wasn't like as super slick. It's a little bit slower pace and stuff like that, a little bit more meticulous. But I was reading that originally they offered this to Sam Peckinpah first. I guess the producer Al Ruddy offered this to Peckinpah, and they said he came in and took a physical and had just recently had a heart attack and failed the physical, and so they gave it to oh man, I'm trying to think of the director.
Robert Aldrich.
Robert Aldrich, yeah, I gave it to him for a while, and then he dropped it, and then Peter Hunt came in, which I think was a good choice.
Well, I like it because it also still has. This is a film that can't be too polished, right? If it's too polished, it doesn't work. There is a lot of ruggedness to this movie production wise, not just, the thematically. And I think one of the best examples of that is, the cabin standoff, that siege scene. It has a lot of tension built around it. That action really works. We talked about it online for a little bit. I love how he like Kevin McAllister's his cabin. He digs
Yeah.
trenches all around it because he knows they're going to shoot low. He's got his shotguns in all the corners of the houses. Like he really did Home Alone this house, and it works to his advantage. But there's also like the scenes where they blow his house up with dynamite and he pops out of this backlit hole with two shotguns blaring. It's a very action moment, right? I don't think Peckinpah or Aldrich would have brought that kind of heroic action star moment. That's kind of like a James Bond moment, in my opinion. But because you can tell it's backlit, because there is a slight suspension of disbelief of how it's framed and how that scene plays out, you feel like you are in an action movie, and it's that little break from the pursuit and the coldness and the majesticness of the wilderness. I think it's a really great kind of centerpiece of the film before it takes us to the pursuit, because it gives us that moment that action fans are waiting for.
Yeah.
We got drama, 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 action, action, and then pursuit. So I think formulaically it works perfectly.
Yeah, and that works for Peter Hunt because he was an editor. He edited a lot of the
Yeah.
Bond films, so he knows about pacing. And even though some of the shots may not be as stylistic as on Her Majesty's Secret Service, like you said, the siege scene with the cabin, you know the geography perfectly. He
Mhm.
sets that up perfectly. The wide shots. There's like six guys on this side, three guys on that side, one guy in the bush, and you can see where everything is. And then when that first shot goes off, you know exactly where you are. You know who's doing what, and it's really it's well done. And I think Peckinpah, if you'd had him do it, obviously you would have had some slow motion going for you know 2 minutes, and I think the cutting, the way Peter Hunt cut it, I think it works better for that. But I still would have loved to have seen a Peckinpah version of this. I think it would have been pretty cool too.
I think so. It probably would have been a lot more. It would have been bloodier, and it probably would have followed the relationship, which doesn't really seem to fit in this movie, between Angie Dickinson and Lee Marvin. Like that scene really doesn't make a lot of sense. Like she's a widow of a trapper, and they have like a fleeting romance. It feels really inserted. Like it almost feels like a production guy was like, "Listen, we need to have a girl in here somewhere, right? It can't just be the Buffalo woman that everyone in the
Right.
Mountie tent sleeps with. We have to have a pretty face for a second." And it was supposed to be Joan Collins at first, which I think would have been more unbelievable because Angie Dickinson is rough enough to make sense that she's out in the tundra. Joan Collins in the tundra makes no sense at all. So
No.
I'm glad that they didn't go that
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah, but they do have good chemistry, like Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson. I mean, obviously they had done two movies before this, The
Mhm.
Killers and Point Blank, so they have instant chemistry. So that part of it works. But I do agree with you; it does feel like it's kind of crowbarred in there.
It's crowbarred in there. It does kind of kill that magnificent pacing we were talking about, but it's such a brief scene. It is practically a cameo that while I do find it unnecessary, it doesn't take the train off the rails, right? Like you can still follow the movie. It's just like a slight detour of it. That being said, I'll watch Angie Dickinson in anything.
Hell yeah!
Like she could have just walked past the screen and be like, "Oh, it's Angie Dickinson," and I love it. Like she's so great. Big Bad Mama, one of my favorite movies of all time.
Oh yeah. What about Big Bad Mama too?
It's not bad, man, except it was made for TV, but it's not terrible.
Yeah. No, but I mean, if you put Angie Dickinson in something, she's going to be on the poster, right? So that's going to be a marketing
Yeah.
a marketing point.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about like this pursuit scene now, like this is where I feel the budget kind of starts to show its bones when they bring in the World War I pilot and his biplane to kind of hunt him down. It's a great action piece. It's a great action scene, but there are moments in it where it's like, okay, I can tell this is a rear projected shot in a film that's been showing us so many just natural shots and cinematic moments. When we do introduce that piece of technology into it, which again thematically is correct because it is showing that pull away of the old ways into the new ways. Lee Marvin's against it. This guy is a real kind of cocky hothead, it's almost better for some of these guys, right? Because they were already at the end of the ropes anyway. And if we're going to have a story that really gets us in the gut, that's a moment that's going to do it, where it's friendly fire, and it's friendly fire from an imperfect technology that people are so proud of. And I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I like that too. And when I watched that scene yesterday, it did reinforce the idea that, it kills Lee Marvin's friend, and at the same time that represents the new thing coming in to take his place, because that plane will eventually take the place of what he did, and then it
Mhm.
took out his friend. And I think that's what's really cool about the movie. And I think historically that this was the first manhunt with a plane. Am I not? I think I read that right.
That's how I read it too.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that
Absolutely.
was a part of the real story too. And I think they, if you didn't, if you didn't have that Carl Weathers scene there, I think maybe the plane wouldn't have as much significance, because it does reinforce to Lee Marvin that I'm being replaced. The new things are coming for me.
That's a great point, because we've mentioned some of the scenes already where they're exposition scenes, and this is something that I do miss in films, the way that screenwriters used to write, where I feel, and I say this all the time on my show, we get a lot of hand holding in modern cinema, where they almost feel, and I'm not sure if it's the writer, maybe the writer has like his first draft, and then of course the suits come in, or the director's like, well, I really want the audience to understand this, let's simplify it, let's add an extra scene in. The hand holding in modern cinema, I think, is egregious, and it's insulting to the intelligence of its audience, where we're talking about a film now where they're just kind of getting drunk and they're talking about their lives in the Mounties cabin. Carl Weathers has that speech, Andrew Stevens has his speech, and he's starting to kind of fit in now with the Mounties. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll take a stab at the Buffalo Woman. I'll have some of your booze. Those moments all mean something later, but it's not hand holding you into what it means. You have to pay attention. I honestly feel that a lot of screenwriters these days, and maybe it's not intentional, maybe it's because they are given direction by the suits and by directors, I almost feel like they know that their audiences don't have attention spans like they used to, because they got their phone, or they got their friends, or they've got their laptop in front of them while they're watching a movie, and they have to just give them the key moments of exposition and get the plot progression forward in the easiest way possible. So if they do miss a line of dialogue, when something like that happens, it makes sense. I mean, I think they're so egregious about it now that they'll put a fucking flashback from that conversation right in front or after a scene that happens later, just to emphasize the point. Remember when so and so said this? They don't give us the opportunity to be critical thinkers ourselves anymore and be able to catch lines of dialogue, be able to catch plot points and story notes that make sense later on without holding our hand. And that's a perfect example. That scene of them bullshitting in the Mounties cabin, and then the things that happen to these characters in the pursuit, they're connected, but only if you are listening and watching.
Yeah, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with Bronson and Marvin's face. Like Bronson, if a younger person I think was watching a Bronson movie, they would expect him to talk more. But from Bronson's perspective, he wanted less dialogue. Like he would take out
Mhm.
stuff, and he doesn't have to say anything. Like his face says stuff. He's expressive. But I think, like you said today, younger audience, you have distractions. You have your phone. You're going to look down. You're going to miss that. But today, we're, like you said, we're going to replace that with a scene of exposition, like dialogue. Like if you notice, like characters just constantly talk, 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 talk.
Mhm.
There's very little, like in modern movies, there's very little time for people or characters like staring or
Right.
thinking, thinking something through themselves without talking. And, there's a lot of that in this movie, especially with Bronson, because he's the one being chased, obviously. So he doesn't have anyone to talk to, but he does a lot of stuff where he's, trying to grab a fish with his hand through the ice. And, there's no dialogue there.
I think a filmmaker that does it so well contemporarily that I don't think people recognize or give a lot of credit is Nicholas Winding Refn.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
in Drive and Only God Forgives and even Neon Demon, he tells the story so much with faces and with scenes and with cinematography that he understands. You don't need to have dialogue fill the page just to get your movie going. You can tell so much of a story with a face, and these two do it perfectly, especially Bronson, especially when he's by himself out in the tundra and he's scoping the land and he's glassing his environment. You can see the calculations of which way to go and what to do. So when he does do clever things like put his snowshoes backwards or jog with a herd of caribou to cover his tracks, you're like, oh god damn, that guy is so smart. But you see the calculations in a silent moment where I feel like these days we would have like a narration behind it, or like him whisper like, okay, maybe if I do this or maybe do this. Like it holds our hands.
Right.
And I just appreciate the old school methods that this movie portrays.
Yeah, it's a good reference in WR. He does that a lot, and especially Neon Demon and some of those Amazon series, and the
Yeah.
Netflix one, which the title escapes me, but there are scenes in those films where nothing, like there is no dialogue for 10 minutes, like it's all just cutting from face to face to face, and you know what's going on. I don't need
Yeah.
dialogue, I understand it, but like you said, yeah, younger people and stuff like that, not to dump on them, they're smart too, but it's a different aesthetic from, I guess this was made in '80, so we're starting kind of that transition period into more and more and more dialogue. And I mean, look at Bronson in Once Upon a Time in the West. I mean,
Yeah.
he doesn't need to say a damn thing.
Not many people do. I mean, Robart says the most, I think, in that movie, because he is the guy that has to come in with the clever quips and stuff like that. But when it comes to Fonda and Bronson, yeah, just show us their faces, show us their eyes, and that's what we want to see, and let the other characters cover the exposition 100%. I think it's an interesting topic now too, thinking about like contemporary cinema and the performances of these two guys. I'm not a Tarantino podcast. I barely mention him on my show, but there's something that I've always thought of, and that is with a guy that was still is, because he's still not on his last movie yet, so obsessed with bringing like the last little bits of life and entertainment from some of these older performers, bringing them into the movies. He puts Bruce Stern and stuff now, when he brought back Travolta or Robert Forster. I feel like Bronson was like the guy that could have, should have been in some kind of Tarantino project. I'm not even sure if he ever tried. I think the last thing I saw Bronson in was The Indian Runner,
Yeah.
As a character that wasn't necessarily a Bronson type character. And so it makes me think of like lost opportunities of like maybe he passed away before the right role was written. But especially a movie like this, it does feel like it's the kind of thing that Tarantino would pull from, and that Bronson would have been a character in his film. It makes me sad because I feel like he didn't make it past the 90s when people like him and Lee Marvin were reintroduced because of pop culture of the 90s, where they weren't like kind of brought back for like their last little swan song because people now were discovering them because of references in movies, I'd say Tarantino's probably the biggest one, I bet you're a big Lee Marvin fan. Yeah, I fucking love that guy. A bunch of people who saw that movie probably didn't know who Lee Marvin was, and so that line went right over their head. But now that we have streaming, now that we have boutique labels, we have podcasts like this where we can celebrate guys like this. I wish that we would have had them a little bit longer so they could have enjoyed the fruits of that labor.
Yeah, I think people our age too, like if we didn't have VHS back in the day, that was our streaming, that was our introduction to Lee Marvin and Bronson and all these guys. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have known who they were either, because their prime was way before we were born. Well, I mean, kind of somewhat in there, but we would have missed out on that boat too, and we wouldn't have known about them. So yeah, I think Tarantino and Bronson would have been.
Oh, it would be that kind of homage, to be that kind of prestige to have a guy like that from the old school, or even Telly Savalas too. Like Telly Savalas, fucking love that guy, and people only recognize him more now because of references and caricatures, and The Simpsons, stuff like that. It's like, no, this guy was the guy in the 70s. He was Kojak and he was a great villain. He's one of my favorite Blofelds, right? It's just interesting that we don't see a lot of recognition for some of these guys until that pop culture boom of the 90s. And by that point, it was too late because they weren't around anymore. And I almost wish there was like an Earth 2, right? or a different dimension where we had these guys a little bit longer and they were staples throughout the 90s and 2000s and could really enjoy what we're talking about now, the prestige.
Yeah, I have a friend that is heavily into Jason Statham movies and has been for a long time. And I tried to tell him like a lot of his whole career path is basically kind of Bronson esque.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's even remade like what two Bronson or a
Yeah.
couple of Bronson movies, I think, and he redid the Killer Elite. So he's really like on that path of being that kind of action star guy that starts off in bigger pictures, more prestige pictures, and then sort of works his way down into character parts. and
Right.
it's really interesting. And so, but like you said, I mean, today it'll probably be an aftermarket for Jason Statham, and it's kind of up to guys like us to keep the Bronson and Lee Marvins. And
Agreed. I mean, even now that you mention it, he also played Parker in a film,
no, that's
which was a Lee
true.
Marvin
That's
character.
true.
So,
Yeah.
so yeah, he does kind of follow a more energetic version of those classic characters.
Right. Well, that's what's cool about the ending scene. I don't know if you were going to get into that.
Let's do it.
Yeah, because that ending scene I really love, where obviously they know that Bronson's pulled a kind of an okey doke on him with what's it? I keep wanting to call him something else. I don't know, the Mad.
I just call him the Mad Trapper.
I keep wanting to say the Mad Hatter. But yeah, when he does the Mad Trapper swap, and Lee Marvin knows that he's going to leave or has gotten away and can clearly see it and lets him go. I thought that was really, really, really beautiful moment between those two guys, because not only did it work for the movie, but I think if you were a film fan back then and even now, you can kind of see like they're like, just let it go, just let it go. Let's stop, doing this, and let's live our lives. It's not worth it. And the fact that Lee Marvin almost kind of tries to give credit to Andrew Stevens, like, hey, you're the new guy. I think that it's time for me and Bronson to walk off and pass the mantle.
Do you think, because there's a thing I've always wondered. So Andrew Stevens says that his face was shot off. Now, Lee Marvin, after he puts the guy down, he's like, he didn't move like Johnson. So do you think that Charles Bronson shot his face off during the shootout to kind of help enhance the point that he'd be harder to recognize as Albert Johnson if his face was blown off? Or do you think that Andrew Stevens actually shot his face off and it was just a coincidence that they can't recognize him other than the fact that he didn't move like him when they shot him? I'm still kind of ambiguous on what really happened.
Yeah, and they do leave that ambiguous as well. And I don't know. I guess like the visual the visual part of me thinks that Bronson did it, but it would be interesting. But I don't think Andrew Stevens. I don't see anything in his character that would go through with that. That would just be my first take.
We just know that he's a better shot than people gave him credit for,
Yeah.
like when he was shooting the rabbits and stuff earlier. So it's like, well, maybe he did shoot the guy in the face just trying to put him down, and by happenstance, that's going to make him harder to identify. But as we both know, Andrew Stevens sees him run away through the binoculars, so it's like up to him to kind of keep that. But he understands. He understands, like, okay, are we going to keep wasting resources? Are we going to keep wasting people's lives and time and effort, and we're almost out of food? This guy's just going to keep on going. Or we can tie it up with a bow right now. I think they both have like a handshake in that moment of like, this is what we're going to do. You can be this kind of Mountie, or you can be the kind of Mountie that you want to be, but this is the point where I'm ending, you're starting, and this is the way we're doing it. I think it's kind of agreed upon both of them that that's the best course of action.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the unsaid agreement between Marvin and Bronson. Like, they both realized at that cabin that this is stupid. Like, this is dumb. Why are we here? and I think it kind of ties up right there at that mountain peak where they both kind of have that look again. It's just like, okay, you know what, this was really dumb, and I think Lee Marvin finally realizes like I'm running out of friends here for something that's not worth it.
When we talk about the real story, so like the real Albert Johnson was shot and killed. The real Edgar Millen was shot and killed by Albert Johnson. So they don't cover that in the movie. One of the coolest points, though, that I read about the real story is that, for like the days and days and days that this guy was on the run from this militia, when they finally caught him and killed him and they did the autopsy, they essentially showed that while he was in pursuit from these guys, he was essentially burning 10,000 calories a day running nonstop with all that gear through the tundra. And I just thought that was an interesting fact because I know how hard it is for me to try and burn 400 calories on the treadmill, let alone
Right.
10,000.
That's a lot. Yeah, it does make you. Well, but there are some scenes where Bronson looks like he's physically about to break.
Right.
When his face is kind of cracked and he's kind of like getting a little tired and maybe kind of worn out and sleepy, and so they do kind of touch on that a little bit, but not to that degree. I don't think Bronson's Fitbit was going off.
Yeah, right. No, I don't think it ever did. This is a really great conversation. This is a great movie. Before we finish the conversation on that, I got two questions for you. Number one, what was your favorite moment in the film? And number two, I already gave mine away. Is there a film that you would pair with this? Like, what would you think would make a great double feature with Death Hunt?
Ooh, okay. My favorite moment, just because I'm a Bronson file and I love the cadence of Bronson's voice. There's a scene early on where he's in the ammo general store buying the ammo, and the caretaker there is telling him a story about how some guy went crazy because of gigantic mosquitoes, and he got so crazy that he blew his own head off, and Bronson kind of takes a beat and just says, "Well, that's one way to stop the buzzing."
Love that scene. Love that scene. Love that delivery. It almost reminds me of like, do you believe in Jesus?
Oh yeah,
Well, you're gonna meet him.
yeah. I say that one all the time.
Well,
A
I already
pairing.
said that my pairing would be with The Fugitive because, like I said, I think they share a DNA, even though they're both very different in pacing and then thematics. But I think that old guard versus new guard, that man on a mission, regardless what that mission is, we have to pursue it. It's almost like Heat too, where it's like Vincent Hanna has respect for Neil McCauley, but it's his job and it's his life to put guys like that down. Just because you have to kill a guy doesn't mean you don't respect him for the way he does things or his ideologies.
Well, funny you said that because I think that would be my pairing. Would be Heat. There's
Beautiful.
a scene in Death Hunt where they're both looking at each other. I think it's Lee Marvin has the binoculars, and I think does Bronson have them as well? I can't remember, but
He
they're
does.
okay. They're both staring at each other down a mountain with binoculars, and it's very akin to that scene in Heat where Vincent Hanna is in the shipping yard and De Niro's watching him, and he
Right.
realizes
With
that
the camera.
they're being watched. So that kind of I think that's kind of an interesting pairing.
All right, motherfucker.
What do you got?
Beautiful. I love this movie. I'm so glad that you picked it, and I'm glad to speak to another Charles Bronson file because, again, this guy was just a movie star beyond words. There was no one else like him. I don't think there'll ever be anyone else like him. And the fact that he was able to navigate almost 4 decades of cinema and reinvent himself in his movies, but still be him, I think it's such a rare thing to see. And like I said, even the canon movies, which are silly, they're still a good time, and I still love watching him in them, right? Kinjite is a questionable movie, but he's so fucking good. 10 to Midnight is bonkers. Andrew Stevens in that one as well, but he's so fucking good. So, yeah, I celebrate the dude's entire catalog.
Oh yeah, I do too. I mean my whole introduction to him was the cannon fodder. So
Right.
and then I had to go backwards from there. And then when I saw him in The Great Escape and Dirty Dozen and Magnificent Seven, I was like, oh my gosh, like, this guy's amazing. And, like you said, he is just so unique. Like, that's the reason why I wanted to do the documentary on him. There is nobody like Charles Bronson. Like, he stands completely alone. Like, there's no one even near him.
All right, Eric. So before we let you go, let's get you the opportunity to tell people where they can find your content, where your socials are. I'll have them in the notes of this episode and in my Cultworthy Partners page on my website. But please tell people where they can find you, what you're all about, and what they can look forward to with your content.
Cool. Well, you can find me at cinemaforce.net. If you type that in, that should take you to the YouTube page. And I'm also on Instagram at cinemaforce. And the YouTube page is mostly for essays that we do on cinema, video essays. It's me. And then I have a few guests that will come on and do stuff like Michael Price and Rich Johnson. And so we're kind of, there's no like real super plan for it. It's just kind of as we go. And the stuff that we have coming up right now, we just finished a huge hour-long retrospective on Quatermass, of the series and the movies. And that was like one of my dream projects. I've always wanted to do something on Quatermass. Man, what do we got coming up? We got Batman, Mask of the Phantasm. Just to drop one on Alien, the first Alien movie today. And then The Hot Spot with Don Johnson, Dennis Hopper movies coming up.
Great movie.
Yeah. So,
Jennifer Connelly.
Oh, yeah. Virginia Madsen.
One of my favorite things, man, watching you do is being able to show all the press kits from these things. Like,
oh, yeah.
That's one of my favorite parts about your content and your channel is, I think people forget that they used to put out these big press kits that had pictures and stories and in boutique labels. Now we get to see some of that. We get like photocopies of some of them, but the fact that you're able to show how they would market these movies and test screenings and things like that, it's just a lot of fun for cinephiles like me. So I can't thank you enough for being able to bring that content to us.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And that's something I just really do on the Instagram channel. And I'm able to do that because of my former boss at NBC, Bobby Wygant. And she was the entertainment reporter there. And she worked there for almost 70 years, if you can believe that. But, we did the press junkets and all that stuff. And so, we have, 50, 60 years of press kits and interviews with everybody. And so I'm able to share those on Cinema Force and people like yourself, and they really, really love them. And I'm glad somebody other than me loves them, because, if it wasn't for, the people that are really liking them, I'd probably just keep them in a box and look at them myself.
Absolutely. And before I let you go, I love your background, all the Charles Bronson stuff you got there. You got the Death Hunt DVD screen or Blu-ray screen on your computer. So way to go on that.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. I love your show, man. I listen all the time. I'm going to back up and listen to it, but I love your show. I think it's really great. And I think you're a fantastic host. You're really good. You're very good.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to me where I get people who I've been following before I even started doing the podcast to be able to be on my show and enjoy it, right?
Right.
I just hope people have like a fun time listening to us talk about movies, because at the end of the day, that's really all I want to do. I give a shit about the cameras. I just want to talk about movies with people that love movies.
Yeah, same here.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening, watching. Please follow Cinema Force on all the channels that he just explained. And don't forget to follow The Cultworthy on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter /X. And you can find all of my reviews, blogs, episodes, and links to people like Eric on thecultworthy.com in the Cultworthy Partners page. And we will see you next week.
Bye.